Who saw 1066 coming? Did it show any signals on the horizon? It's interesting that many of the, or several of the big dates in English history took people by surprise. And you could argue that 1066 was one of them. The Civil War was another. The Civil War broke out in 1642. But in 1641, nobody had the faintest idea that the Civil War was on the way. And when it broke out, many, many men, serious, scholarly, sensitive men, knowledgeable men, scratched their heads, shook their heads, and said, how on earth did this come about? How did we get to be in this position of fighting a war against our fellow countrymen? Same thing happened in 1914. The country went on holiday in July of 1914. They'd heard that some Austrian duke had got himself assassinated. That was a bit of a yawn. Nobody took much notice. And by August the 4th, the whole of Europe was at war. Again, men shook their heads and wondered how on earth it had all come about. The big things take you by surprise. All right, William the Conqueror, let's go back to 1066. William the Conqueror saw it coming, all right? He wanted it to come. All he had to do was to wait for Edward the Confessor to die, and Edward was not all that old, so he might have to wait a long time. But did France want it, or did France see it coming? Very unlikely. The French king would always look out for an opportunity to score over Normandy. But beyond that, I don't see how his crystal ball could have told him anything about the events of 1066 in advance. England, no, we had a safe king, Edward the Confessor. We know that, well, they knew then that he didn't have an obvious successor, and they knew they didn't want William. But by this time, clearly, far and away above everybody else, the second man in the kingdom was Harold, the Earl of Wessex. He was the king's right-hand man. He was the second man in the kingdom. He practically ran the country. If ever there was an obvious next king, it was Harold. The only thing against him was that he did not belong to the blood royal, but he was the obvious next king. Did other people take notice? Yes, surprisingly, Norway took notice, because there was a very powerful and a king in Normandy, also called Harold. We distinguish the two because our Harold was Harold with an O. In Norway, it was Harald with an A. And he had an eye on the throne of England too. He was another prince, always looking out for the main chance. He had a fearsome reputation. He had fought everybody. He had been in every country. He had even been a member of the legendary bodyguard of the emperor at Constantinople, no less. It was a fearsome, legendary reputation, and the mere sight of him was enough to strike awe into anybody. Apparently, he stood 6'6", when the average height of a man was barely 5'6". And Harold of Normandy, Harold Hardrada they called him, the stern ruler, he had eyes for the English crown. So there were the Norwegians, all ready to jump when something happened. By the same token, surprisingly, Denmark had eyes on England as well. Doesn't look a very big country now, and it isn't, but it was very powerful. In the 11th century, we had already had 4 Danish kings. Everybody's heard of King Canute, but he wasn't the first, he was the second. His father, Sweyn, conquered England in 1014, and son Canute succeeded in 1016, and his 2 sons succeeded him in 1035. We had 4 Danish kings. So the Danes were very interested in what was going on in England in 1066. Flanders, which is nowadays Holland and Belgium, they were interested too, not so much because of politics, but because of the trade. Flanders was the centre of a wool and weaving trade. England produced an awful lot of sheep. An enormous amount of trade passed between the two countries. So the Count of Flanders was immensely interested in English politics for business reasons. Germany, no, probably too far away. But soldiers of fortune in Germany kept their eyes and ears open, and there was no shortage of soldiers of fortune. When William was building his army in the middle of 1066, they came flocking in from everywhere. Germany, Denmark, Lorraine, Alsace, Switzerland, northern Italy, northern Spain, you name it, they came in from these places to join William's army and see what rich pickings there would be. A word of warning: when you decide to study any year from the past, always try and look at it from the point of view of the people who lived in it. Don't look at 1066 with the preconceptions of the year 2019. An obvious example is this word Europe. Now, we know that France and England and Italy and Spain and all the rest in 1066 were in the continent of Europe, just as they are today. And we talk about living in Europe today, but men in 1066 did not talk about living in Europe. If they wanted a word to convey the whole lot, if you like, they called it Christendom. It was where the word of Christ was supreme. This was the land which had been founded by the Holy Roman Catholic Church, God's church. They did not use the word Europe. They regarded Christendom as not just a stretch of land, but it was a fortress, it was a bastion, it was the final defense against this sea of wilderness and paganism and heresy that threatened the entire, what we call, Western Europe. Not only that, we were at the mercy of the elements. To the west was the Atlantic Ocean, and nobody knew where that went. To the north was ice and snow, nobody knew how far that went. To the east was miles and miles of forest and marsh. If you went further north, it was tundra and more ice and snow. If you went south, you would run into the Sahara Desert. So you've got to remember that men in those days, if they thought at all, thought about the world as I say, this bastion of Christendom, against the elements, against savage weather, against the climate, and against the pagans and the Muslims and the infidels and whatever other unpleasant adjective you had for describing them. For those who lived in Christendom and who fought to keep it going, life, in a word, was hard. It was a vale of tears. It was hard, and it didn't last very long. If you made it to 45 or 50, you were doing pretty well. All you could hope for was that when it was over, if you're lucky, you might go to paradise, which was going to be absolutely wonderful. It jolly well better be after the terrible things that they'd had to put up with in the life they were living. And when you died, of course, it was your body only that died. Your soul survived. And it was your soul that was going to go, you hoped, to heaven. So your soul was important. No matter how harsh life was, no matter how unpleasant many people were, no matter how much cruelty, no matter how much cheating, no matter how much murder, no matter how much crime, most men and women at bottom accepted the fact that your soul was there and that it was eternal, and that it was important. People were concerned about they were concerned enough about what happened to their bodies, but they were even more concerned about what happened to their eternal soul.